Welcome back, everyone, to Sip and Talk.
Hey there. You know, looking at the international news lately, especially the big power frictions, it really feels like some kind of weird restrictive delivery service, doesn't it?
Huh. That's a good way to put it. Like everything's suddenly about limits or retaliation. The U.S. says no advanced chips for you.
And then China turns around and says, okay, fine, then maybe you don't get so much rare earth material. It's like this constant tit for tat.
Yeah, exactly. It feels like, I don't know, an angry kid who didn't get the toy they wanted, so now they're trying to hide everyone else's candy.
Yeah.
Just taking their ball and going home, but on a global scale.
That's depressingly accurate, actually. And this kid, they complain really loudly about, say, being kicked out of the fancy five-star restaurant while threatening that if they don't get back in, nobody else gets their, their daily bread. Basic stuff.
Okay, that analogy, five-star meal versus daily bread, that's brilliant. Let me guess, is that from our friend Mickey?
Chuckles lightly.
Yeah.
You got that, huh? Yeah, he does come up with some gems sometimes. Have you actually watched any of his videos yet?
Not yet, sorry. Need to get on that. But speaking of Mickey and thinking about Taiwan, are they just quietly picking up the breadcrumbs while all this is going on and practicing with their shields?
That's exactly it. And that brings us right to what we're diving into today, the whole Taiwan shield concept and this bigger game of global chokeholds. Mutually assured dependency, you could almost call it.
Okay, so that's our mission for this Sip and Talk session. We're going to break down this Taiwan shield strategy.
Yep. And we'll dig into the psychology behind China's, let's say, assertiveness rooted in that century of humiliation narrative.
And finally, apply that daily bread versus five-star meal test. Is the retaliation we're seeing actually proportional, or is it something else?
It's a packed agenda. We'll start with the Taiwan shield, what it is, what it isn't, then look at who each side really sees as the main opponent. It's kind of a mirror image thing.
Then the big thought experiment. What would actually make the U.S. step in militarily? What are those red lines?
Crucial question. After that, we'll get into the history, the psychology, the century of humiliation, versus what some inside China might see as the real national shame.
Okay. And then wrap up with China's track record on, let's say, playing by the rules and that proportionality question on rare earths versus chips. Let's start with the shield. All right, let's jump into the Taiwan shield, or TDOM. President Lai Ching-te brought this up in the 2025 National Day address. Is this a major change, like a whole new way of thinking about defense for Taiwan?
Oh, definitely. I mean, it signals a real shift. They're moving away from just, passive defense towards something more like active resilience. That's the term
active resilience. Okay.
The basic idea of the TDOM is building this really comprehensive layered air and missile defense system. It's designed to be highly integrated, spot threats quickly, and intercept pretty much anything coming through the air.
So not just ballistic missiles. We're talking drones, cruise missiles, fighter jets, the whole package. High, medium, low altitude.
Exactly. Covering the whole spectrum. Now, a lot of people immediately jump to comparing it to Israel's Iron Dome.
Right. I heard that comparison too. Is it fair?
It's helpful maybe to grasp the idea of shooting down lots of incoming stuff effectively, but the scale and the type of threat, totally different. Iron Dome is mainly for shorter range rockets, mortars, simple stuff, relatively speaking.
Whereas Taiwan's
looking at the PLA's huge arsenal. We're talking thousands of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, really advanced drones, and the big one, those new hypersonic weapons like the DF-17, which are incredibly hard to deal with.
Okay, so TDOM isn't one single magic bullet system. It's more like a network.
Precisely. It's about knitting together what they already have. The Patriot missiles, their own Tiangong or Skybow missiles, and upgrading them, integrating them with new radars, better command and control systems, the C2 stuff.
Right.
The TDOM is like the operating system, maybe. The concept that makes all these different layers, low, medium, high altitude defenses work together seamlessly, passing off targets without dropping the ball.
So why now? What's the trigger for this big strategic push? Did recent Chinese military drills expose something specific? A weak spot?
Yes, that's exactly the strategic driver here. Military analysts for a while now have been pointing to Taiwan's vulnerability in what they call the mid-segment of missile defense.
Mid-segment? What exactly does that mean?
Okay, picture a ballistic missile's flight path. It goes up, reaches its highest point, the apex, then starts coming back down towards the target. The mid-segment is that tricky phase after the apex as it's re-entering the atmosphere, but before it gets really close in its final dive.
Okay, so it's moving super fast then, and the window to hit it is really small.
Extremely small, and incredibly fast. The existing systems, like the Patriot and older Tiangong versions, well, there was a perceived gap there. If China launched a massive coordinated attack, what they call a saturation attack, some missiles could potentially just slip through that mid-segment gap.
I see.
So the T-dome is designed specifically to patch that seam, get better overlapping coverage, maybe with newer interceptors or better targeting, to make sure nothing gets through that critical phase.
This sounds eye-wateringly expensive. How are they planning to pay for all this?
Funding is obviously key. And President Lai set a really ambitious target, getting defense spending up to 5% of GDP by 2030.
5%. Wow. What is it now, roughly?
Well, the 2026 budget already hit 3.32%, which was itself a record high for them. So jumping to 5% is a huge statement. It's basically saying peace comes from strength, loud and clear.
It sends a message externally, but also boosts confidence at home, I imagine.
Both. It's definitely meant to reassure people inside Taiwan, build that sense of security. But, crucially, it jacks up the price tag for any potential invasion. Makes Beijing think twice about the cost, the complexity, the potential for failure.
That kind of spending and the tech involved,
Yeah.
it must mean a lot of international cooperation, right? Especially with the U.S.
Absolutely essential. This isn't something Taiwan can realistically build entirely on its own. It needs deep coordination, technology transfer, help integrating everything from partners, mainly the U.S.
So the cooperation itself is part of the deterrence?
Exactly. It sends a clear signal. Attack Taiwan. And you're not just facing Taiwan's defenses, you're facing a system built with and potentially networked into the most advanced capabilities of the U.S. and its allies. That adds another layer of complexity for any attacker.
Okay, let's pour some cold water, as they say. No defense is perfect. What are the real-world limits here? Can the T-dome actually guarantee Taiwan won't be hit?
No. Absolutely not. And it's crucial. Everyone understands that. It's a deterrent. It raises the cost. It complicates planning. But it is not some kind of magical, impenetrable shield.
So what's the main weakness?
The oldest problem in missile defense: saturation. Even Israel's Iron Dome, which is very effective, can be overwhelmed if enough rockets are fired all at once. The PLA has literally thousands of missiles. If they decide to launch a massive simultaneous strike from multiple directions,
Even the best system might miss them or run out of interceptors.
or just get overloaded. The tracking systems, the command centers, there are physical limits. A sufficiently large saturation attack is designed to find those failure points.
And then there's the technology race. Build a better shield.
And your opponent builds a better sword.
Right.
Or in this case, a faster, sneakier missile. That brings us to the advanced threats, especially hypersonics.
Like the DF-17 you mentioned.
Exactly. These things travel incredibly fast, Mach 5+, but they also often maneuver during flight. They don't follow a simple ballistic arc. They can glide, they can jeep.
Making them super hard to track and hit.
Extremely difficult for current radar and interceptor technology. These weapons are basically tailor-made to defeat layered defenses like the T-dome aims to be. So that's an ongoing challenge.
If Taiwan is pouring potentially 5% of its GDP into this shield, is there a risk of becoming too focused on just military hardware? Does it detract from other kinds of resilience?
That's a really important question, and the strategists know it. True security, real resilience, isn't just about shooting down missiles. If you rely only on the T-dome, you're neglecting other vital pillars.
Such as?
Well, conventional military strength tanks, planes, ships, well-trained troops. Also, building your own defense industry so you're not totally reliant on others. Strong alliances, obviously, but also economic resilience, hardening your infrastructure against attack or blockade, and critically, civil defense, mobilizing the population, making sure people know what to do.
So the shield needs to be part of a bigger picture.
Absolutely. President Lai's strategy does talk about overall resilience, not just the T-dome. Because a perfect shield over a society that collapses internally from lack of power, food, or morale. That's pointless, isn't it?
Okay, let's shift perspective now. Let's define the players here, the adversaries. From Taiwan's point of view, it seems pretty straightforward, right? Objectively, who's the only country explicitly saying they have the right to invade?
Yeah, I mean, there's really no ambiguity there. It's the People's Republic of China, the PRC. This isn't just opinion. It's based on their own laws and actions.
What's the legal basis they claim?
The main one is their 2005 anti-secession law. It explicitly says Beijing reserves the right to use non-peaceful means, that's the official term, if Taiwan formally declares independence, or even if they just indefinitely refuse talks on unification under PRC terms.
And their military actions certainly seem to back up that legal threat.
They absolutely do. We've seen this normalization of intense military pressure, those joint sword exercises they run. They're basically rehearsals for a full air and sea blockade of the island. It's practice.
And the constant flights near Taiwan's airspace.
The numbers are just staggering. flying military aircraft into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, the ADAZ. Public trackers counted over 2,000 sorties individual flights in 2025 alone. That's not normal patrolling. That's sustained aggressive pressure, what analysts call gray zone warfare, designed to wear down Taiwan's Air Force, test their responses, and just normalize the idea that invasion is always on the table.
Okay, so if Taiwan's primary undeniable threat is the PRC, let's flip the mirror. Who is China's main strategic focus, their imagined opponent, so to speak? Is it Taiwan?
Taiwan is definitely what they call a core interest. They frame it as an internal issue, unfinished business in the Civil War. But in terms of their overall military strategy, their force planning, their big investments, the primary imagined enemy is undoubtedly the United States.
Really? More than Taiwan itself?
Yes, and specifically the U.S.-led security structure in the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. forces based in Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Guam, Australia, that whole network.
Why is the U.S. the central focus?
Well, if you read China's official defense white papers, their strategic documents, they consistently frame U.S. presence and alliances in the region as an attempt to contain China's rise. They see U.S. support for Taiwan military sales, political statements, naval patrols as direct interference in their internal affairs and an obstacle to their regional ambitions.
So their military buildup is aimed at pushing the U.S. out of the region, or at least making it too costly for the U.S. to intervene.
That's the core strategic logic. Their long-range missiles, their naval expansion, especially the aircraft carriers and advanced submarines, it's all primarily calibrated to deter or defeat potential U.S. intervention, particularly in a Taiwan scenario.
This connects directly to their nuclear program. Historically, China had this minimum deterrence idea, right? Just enough nukes to guarantee retaliation, but that seems to be changing rapidly.
It's a huge shift, a profound change from decades of doctrine. For the longest time, they kept a relatively small, lean nuclear arsenal. The idea was purely second strike capability. If someone nuked China first, they'd still have enough left to inflict unacceptable damage back. Minimum deterrence.
But
now we're seeing evidence of a massive, rapid expansion and modernization across the board. New missile silos being built, more mobile launchers, and crucially, major investment in the nuclear triad.
The triad meaning land, sea, and air delivery.
Exactly. The capability to launch nuclear weapons from land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, from submarines at sea, SSBNs, and from strategic bombers in the air. They made a point of showing off this full triad capability in their big military parades around 2025. It was a statement.
What kind of numbers are we talking about for this expansion?
The estimates vary, but reports from, say, the U.S. Department of Defense suggest China could have around 700 operational nuclear warheads by 2025, and the projections. Maybe 1,500 warheads by 2035?
1,500? That's a completely different league from minimum deterrence. That starts looking more like parity with the U.S. and Russia.
It's moving in that direction, yes.
Yeah.
It fundamentally changes the strategic balance, even if they stick to their official no first use NFU policy on paper.
Which many analysts are skeptical about now, given this buildup.
Right. Even with the NFU pledge, this massive expansion serves multiple purposes. It's what some call quasi-combat propaganda, those parades, the aggressive rhetoric.
What's the goal of that?
Well, first, it's strategic signaling to the U.S. Interfering in Taiwan will be incredibly risky, potentially catastrophic. It raises the stakes enormously. Second, it's for domestic consumption. It reinforces the Communist Party's image of strength, national rejuvenation, demanding respect, projecting power. They want the world to see them as not just capable, but maybe even eager for a confrontation, even if the reality is they likely still want to avoid a full-blown war.
Okay, this brings us to a really serious, maybe uncomfortable thought experiment. Given everything we've discussed, the U.S. focus, the nuclear buildup, the Taiwan situation, under what specific circumstances might the United States feel compelled to actually use military force against China? What are the real tripwires?
Yeah, this requires a very careful, clear-eyed look at U.S. commitments, interests, and likely strategic calculations. And let's be clear up front. This is purely an analytical framework, trying to understand the potential triggers. It's absolutely not a prediction of war.
Understood, just mapping the potential fault lines. So how should we categorize these scenarios?
I think it's helpful to break them down into categories, maybe starting with the most direct legal or treaty-based triggers and moving towards broader challenges to the global order. Let's call the first category direct attack or treaty obligations. These are the most clear-cut cases.
Okay, what's number one in that category? Presumably Taiwan itself.
Yes. The first and probably most intensely debated scenario is a full-scale invasion of Taiwan. Now, legally, the U.S. position is complicated. The Taiwan Relations Act, the TRA, doesn't explicitly guarantee U.S. intervention like a formal defense treaty would. It mandates providing Taiwan with defense capabilities and maintaining the U.S. capacity to resist coercion.
But it leaves the actual decision to intervene deliberately vague. Strategic ambiguity.
Exactly. But strategically, despite that ambiguity, the consequences of the U.S. not intervening would likely be catastrophic for American credibility worldwide.
How so?
If the U.S. stood by while China forcibly took Taiwan, its entire network of alliances in the Indo-Pacific, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia would basically collapse overnight. Who would trust U.S. security guarantees after that?
Right. The damage would be immense.
So the strong consensus among strategists is that despite the lack of a formal treaty, U.S. intervention, probably starting with air, naval support, intelligence, cyber, electronic warfare, is highly probable in the event of a full invasion. It's almost an existential issue for the U.S. role in Asia.
Okay, what's the next trigger in this category? Something even more direct.
A direct attack on U.S. military assets. It's unambiguous. If a Chinese missile, ship, or plane intentionally or even accidentally, if it's clearly attributable, strikes a U.S. Navy vessel like an aircraft carrier or a reconnaissance plane operating legally, or hits a U.S. base in Japan or Guam.
That changes everything instantly.
Instantly. That directly engages U.S. forces and territory. It invokes the president's constitutional authority as commander-in-chief. Think Pearl Harbor. Think 9/11. The response would likely be immediate and forceful retaliation against the source of the attack. That moves it from competition to active combat in a heartbeat.
And the third trigger under this direct treaty category, it involves allies.
Yes. An attack on a U.S. treaty ally. This is where those formal defense treaties become ironclad. If China uses military force against Japan, say over the disputed Senkaku-Diaoyutai Islands, or attacks Philippine vessels or territory in the South China Sea,
the U.S. is obligated to respond under the mutual defense treaties.
It must respond. There's no ambiguity here like with the TRA. Failure to uphold those treaty commitments would shatter the foundation of the entire U.S. alliance system, not just in Asia, but globally. It would signal the end of the Pax Americana in the region. So intervention is essentially mandatory in those cases.
Okay, that covers the most direct triggers. Let's move to category 2. Strategic and economic escalation. These are actions that might not directly attack the U.S. or allies, but fundamentally threaten the global system the U.S. relies on.
Right. A major trigger here, number 4, would be blocking international sea lanes. We're not just talking about temporary drills that disrupt shipping for a few days. We mean a hard blockade imposed by China on critical waterways like the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea.
How critical are those waterways?
Enormously. Something like 40% of global maritime trade passes through the South China Sea alone. If China tried to choke that off, it would cripple the global economy. The U.S. Navy conducts freedom of navigation operations, FONOPs, precisely to assert the right of passage. A hard blockade would inevitably lead to direct confrontation as the U.S. Navy tried to break it. Maintaining open sea lanes is a core, non-negotiable U.S. strategic interest.
It's the difference between being aggressive on the road and shutting down the entire global highway system. Okay, what's the 5th trigger in this category?
This one's a bit more speculative, but highly dangerous. Forward nuclear deployment. Imagine if China were to deploy nuclear missiles, maybe medium-range ones, onto islands in the Pacific, perhaps in countries where they've gained influence, like the Solomon Islands or Kiribati.
That sounds familiar, like Cuba in 1962.
Exactly. It would trigger a crisis very similar to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Placing offensive nuclear weapons that close to U.S. allies like Australia, or even U.S. territories like Guam, would be seen as an unacceptable existential threat. The U.S. response would likely be swift and severe, intense diplomatic pressure, a naval blockade of the islands involved, and potentially even preemptive military strikes to neutralize the missiles before they became operational.
Okay, that leads us to the final category, category 3. Existential threats, the really extreme, world-changing scenarios.
The first one here is grim but obvious. Use of weapons of mass destruction, WMD. If China were to initiate the use of nuclear weapons first, or perhaps biological weapons on a massive scale.
All bets are off.
All bets are off. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, would likely kick in. The U.S. would retaliate with its own nuclear forces. That signifies the complete collapse of the international order and the potential start of a global thermonuclear war.
And the final trigger, number 7. This one sounds more gradual, more structural. The Thucydides trap idea.
Yes. This is what we could call structural overthrow. It's less about a single event and more about a long-term shift in power. Imagine a scenario, maybe 10 or 15 years down the line, where China achieves clear military parity or even superiority in key areas, and also manages to gain control over critical global choke points, not just sea lanes, but maybe things like the supply chains for advanced artificial intelligence, quantum computing, or biotechnology.
So, a situation where the U.S. feels it's genuinely losing its global leadership position.
Exactly. If the U.S. strategic community comes to believe that China is on the verge of fundamentally overturning the existing global order and establishing its own dominance, that existential fear, the Thucydides trap dynamic, where the established power feels threatened by the rising power, could become overwhelming.
What might the U.S. do then?
In that scenario, you might see the U.S. pursue much more aggressive preemptive containment strategies, not just sanctions, but maybe large-scale cyber warfare, economic decoupling enforced more strongly, trying to actively halt China's ascendancy before it becomes irreversible. The immense danger here is that these aggressive containment measures themselves carry a very high risk of miscalculation and could easily spiral unintentionally into a hot conflict.
So, wrapping up this thought experiment, the key takeaway is that while the U.S. is unlikely to initiate conflict, specific actions by China attacking allies, directly attacking U.S. assets, fundamentally disrupting global trade, or reaching for WMDs or irreversible strategic dominance are the most likely tripwires for intervention.
That seems to be the consensus view, yes. China's actions, not U.S. intent, are seen as the primary potential drivers of conflict.
Okay, let's shift gears from the what-ifs of military triggers to the why. Why does Beijing, and often the broader Chinese discourse online and diplomatically, sometimes seem so prickly, so hyper-nationalist? This almost provocative, go ahead, make my day kind of stance we sometimes see. Does this tie back into history?
Oh, absolutely. It's deeply, deeply intertwined with history, or at least with the official interpretation of history that's been heavily promoted for decades. It all stems from the narrative of the Century of Humiliation.
The Century of Humiliation, that refers to the period from roughly
from the First Opium War around 1840 up until the founding of the People's Republic in 1949. It's a narrative hammered home in schools, in museums, in state media. It's foundational to the modern national identity promoted by the party.
What are the key events highlighted in this story?
It covers a lot of ground. The Opium Wars, definitely. The unequal treaties forced on China by Western powers and Japan, carving out concessions, extraterritorial rights, the loss of territory, the looting of Beijing, the failures against Japan, culminating in the brutal invasion and occupation during World War II. It's a narrative of victimhood, powerlessness, and foreign exploitation.
How dominant is this narrative in, say, education?
Extremely dominant.
Yeah.
Some analyses suggest that maybe 40% or even more of the standard history teaching focuses specifically on this period and its anti-imperialist themes. It's designed to be unforgettable.
So what's the main function of constantly emphasizing this century of victimhood? What does it achieve psychologically and politically?
It's primarily an externalized blame strategy. What that means is all the shame, all the weakness, all the failures of that period are blamed squarely on outside forces, the foreign aggressors. This does two critical things for the Chinese Communist Party.
Okay, what's the first?
First, it legitimizes their rule. The CCP narrative is China was weak and humiliated. Then we came along, we fought off the foreigners, we ended the humiliation, we made China stand up. It positions the party as the nation's savior.
And the second function?
Second, it creates this powerful collective victim identity, a sense that China was wronged, deeply wronged by the world, and therefore now deserves absolute respect, which often translates to deference and must fiercely resist any perceived slight or pressure lest the humiliation return. It fosters a mindset where revenge, or righting historical wrongs, becomes a national mission.
And that's what fuels the hypernationalism, the wolf warrior diplomacy, the often extreme online rhetoric we see. The idea that being tough, even confrontational, is the only way to avoid repeating the past.
Precisely. The underlying belief, constantly reinforced, is that any compromise, any sign of backing down, any acceptance of external criticism is tantamount to surrendering national dignity, to going back to that weak, humiliated state. Therefore, the only acceptable response to pressure, real or perceived, is maximum toughness, often manifesting as what looks like extreme sensitivity or even emotional volatility on the world stage.
This seems to connect to that interesting pattern some analysts talk about, the chokehold swagger cycle. Can you explain that?
Yeah, it's this observation that China often exhibits periods of really intense, dramatic confrontation, the flipping out or applying the chokehold when it feels its core interests or national dignity are challenged. But then this is often followed by a more pragmatic, self-preserving retreat or a softening of tone, the swagger returning. after the pressure eases, especially when the real economic or international consequences start to bite too hard.
It's like a cycle of provocation and then pulling back.
Kind of. One squeeze, and the eyes roll back in fury. But ease the pressure, and the swagger comes right back. It suggests a strategy that uses confrontation for leverage, but is ultimately constrained by pragmatic calculations of cost and benefit.
Can you give some concrete examples of the flip-out or chokehold phase?
Sure. A classic example was the 2012 anti-Japanese riots. This was triggered by the dispute over the Senkaku Youytube Islands. You saw massive protests across many Chinese cities, often turning violent, targeting Japanese cars, businesses, restaurants. In many cases, it seemed tacitly permitted, if not encouraged, by authorities initially. It was a huge, visceral display of national anger meant to put extreme pressure on Japan and signal resolve.
Any other examples?
The 2017 economic retaliation against South Korea is another one. When Seoul decided to deploy the U.S. Saejet missile defense system, Beijing reacted furiously. They didn't launch missiles, but they launched an economic war, restricting Chinese tourism to Korea, cracking down on Korean companies operating in China like Lotte, banning K-pop and Korean dramas. It cost South Korea billions and was clearly meant as punishment and a warning to others. That was a major economic chokehold.
Okay, so those are the flip-outs. What about the swagger retreat part? How does that manifest?
Well, take the 2012 riots. When the central government saw the protests were getting out of hand, potentially destabilizing domestically and damaging China's international image too much, they eventually stepped in quite firmly to quell the violence and restore order. That was the pragmatic retreat the calculation shifted.
And the economic boycotts.
They often tend to fade over time or are quietly managed. For instance, the boycott of Norwegian salmon after the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Liu Xiaobo in 2010. Diplomatic ties were frozen. Salmon imports plummeted. But eventually, after several years, when the diplomatic costs and the desire for normal trade relations outweighed the initial anger, relations were restored, and the salmon started flowing again. The swagger returned, but only after a pragmatic calculation. Similarly, the harshest measures against South Korea over TOD were eventually eased.
So it's a pattern of using intense pressure tactics, but often pulling back just before it causes irreparable self-harm, flexing dramatically, but maybe not wanting to actually break their own economy or become a total pariah.
That seems to be the dynamic. It's a complex dance between asserting national pride and managing practical consequences.
Okay, so the official narrative heavily relies on externalizing blame, focusing on that century of humiliation by foreigners. This leads to a really crucial, maybe more introspective question. For Chinese people who don't fully buy into the official party line, intellectuals, critics, maybe ordinary people who think more independently, or observers looking from the outside, what do they see as the real contemporary national shame? Is it still about foreigners from 100 years ago?
For many clear-eyed observers, both inside and outside China, the answer is a resounding no. The deepest, most profound shame isn't about historical defeats by external powers. It's about the internal betrayals. It's about the systematic oppression, the manipulation, and the self-deception imposed by the government on its own people, right here, right now.
Internal betrayal. That's a powerful phrase. Let's break that down. What's the first aspect of this internal shame? You mentioned enslaving the people.
It's the shame of seeing grand narratives like national rejuvenation or stability used as justification for controlling, censoring, and persecuting citizens. When people are forced to publicly praise the power that oppresses them, when they cannot openly discuss catastrophic historical events caused by the government itself, like the millions persecuted during the Cultural Revolution or the violent crackdown in Tiananmen Square in 1989 that forced silence, that coerced loyalty over conscience, is seen as a profound national degradation. It's a system that, some argue, values the party's power far above the people's well-being or dignity.
The second point you raised was governing by lie. How does that contribute to this sense of shame?
There's a deep shame associated with living in a system where truth is constantly manipulated or suppressed for political expediency. Think about the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, the silencing of doctors like Li Wenliang who tried to warn others.
Right, his case became a global symbol.
Exactly. Or the manipulation of economic data to always project an image of infallible success. Or the constant censorship that prevents open discussion and criticism. When a government is fundamentally afraid of the truth, afraid of its own people knowing the truth, many see that not as strength, but as a deep-seated weakness and a source of national shame. It prevents genuine progress.
Dr. Li Wenliang's famous last words come to mind. A healthy society should not have only one voice.
Precisely. That resonated so deeply because it spoke to this exact issue. It's a heartbreaking commentary on the cost of enforced silence and institutionalized falsehoods. These aren't wounds inflicted by foreigners, they are self-inflicted.
Okay, the third source of shame, abusing its own people. This points towards human rights issues.
Yes, inevitably. This includes the large-scale, systematic violations of human rights occurring under the guise of stability or counterterrorism. The most prominent example globally is the crisis in Xinjiang.
The situation with the Uyghurs.
Absolutely. The credible reports of mass detention over 1 million Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims held in so-called re-education camps, alongside documented forced labor, coercive birth prevention policies, and the systematic attempt to eradicate their culture and religion. These actions are seen by much of the world, and by many inside China who dare to know, as violating fundamental universal human rights principles. When a state turns on a segment of its own population so brutally, that is viewed as a profound moral failure, a deep stain far worse than any 19th century treaty.
And this pattern extends beyond Xinjiang, doesn't it? Thinking about Hong Kong.
Yes, the imposition of the national security law in Hong Kong in 2020 effectively dismantled the one country, two systems framework that was promised. It crushed political dissent, wiped out independent media, and imposed mainland-style political controls. This was seen not only as a violation of international treaty obligations, the Sino-British Joint Declaration, but also as another example of the state prioritizing absolute control over the rights and freedoms of its own people. It directly contradicts modern universal values of rule of law and human rights.
And the final point of shame you mentioned, refusal to self-reflect.
This is perhaps the most insidious aspect. Chinese civilization has a long, rich tradition of intellectual self-critique. Think of figures like Lu Xun in the early 20th century, who fiercely criticized China's weaknesses, believing self-reflection was essential for progress. But the current political system actively discourages this.
Oh, so?
It equates any criticism of the party or its policies with betraying the nation or being influenced by hostile foreign forces. This conflation deliberately shuts down the possibility of internal debate, constructive criticism, and the kind of self-correction mechanism that is absolutely vital for any society, any civilization, to remain healthy and adapt. When you cannot acknowledge your own mistakes, when you cannot tolerate dissenting voices, you lose the capacity to learn and improve. That inability, that fear of introspection, is seen by many critics as the ultimate, most dangerous shame.
So, to summarize this perspective, the official narrative pushes blame outwards onto historical foreign enemies. But the clear-eyed, critical view sees the real shame as internal, the ongoing betrayal of the Chinese people by their own government through oppression, lies, abuse, and the refusal to honestly confront its own flaws.
That's the core distinction, yes. One narrative fuels external conflict, the other calls for internal accountability and reform.
Okay, so that internal dynamic, the official narrative versus the critical view, the refusal to self-reflect, how does this play out on the world stage? Does it lead to China, well, not always playing by the established international rules?
It certainly seems to manifest as a consistent pattern of prioritizing perceived national interest or party goals over international norms, laws, and commitments when they conflict. There are quite a few prominent examples of this non-compliance or, let's say, rule bending.
Where should we start? The South China Sea seems like a major one.
Definitely. The South China Sea arbitration case from 2016 is Exhibit A. This was a ruling by the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, operating under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, a treaty China itself has ratified.
And this case was brought by the Philippines, challenging China's sweeping claims based on that 9-line, right?
Correct. The tribunal's ruling was unambiguous. It found that China's claims of historical rights within the 9-line had no legal basis under UNCLOS. It specifically ruled against China's claims to sovereignty over certain features, like Mischief Reef, which fall within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. It was a major legal victory for the Philippines and, by extension, for the principle of international maritime law.
But China's reaction was?
Complete rejection. Beijing publicly stated its position as 4 no's. It would not accept, not participate, not recognize, and not implement the ruling, period.
Wow. So just outright defiance of an international legal ruling based on a treaty they signed?
Pretty much. It fundamentally undermined the established global framework for resolving maritime disputes peacefully. And it wasn't just words. Their actions since then have continued to defy the ruling.
Like the recent incidents with Philippine vessels.
Exactly. The repeated use of water cannons, military-grade lasers, and dangerous maneuvering by Chinese Coast Guard and maritime militia vessels against Philippine ships trying to resupply their outpost at Second Thomas Shoal These are clear attempts to enforce China's illegal claims through coercion and intimidation, directly contrary to the 2016 ruling.
Okay, that's maritime law. What about international trade rules? The WTO.
There's history here, too. Back around 2014, the World Trade Organization ruled against China concerning its restrictions on the export of rare earth elements. The U.S., EU, and Japan had filed a case arguing that China's use of export quotas and duties on these critical materials violated its WTO commitments to fair trade.
And the WTO agreed.
Yes. The ruling basically said China was unfairly restricting supply to benefit its domestic industries and gain geopolitical leverage, which went against the trade rules it agreed to when it joined the WTO.
But have they stopped using these kinds of tactics? It feels like we're seeing a resurgence with materials needed for semiconductors.
They've just shifted tactics. Instead of broad quotas, they're now using more targeted export controls. Starting in 2023, they announced restrictions on gallium and germanium,
which are vital for
high-end chips, 5G technology, infrared sensors, solar panels, really critical stuff for modern tech. Then, by 2025, they expanded these controls to cover specific rare earth magnetic technologies and several key elements essential for things like EV motors and wind turbines.
So, despite the earlier WTO ruling, they're still finding ways to weaponize their dominance in these foundational materials.
That's certainly how it's perceived by the U.S. and its allies. They see it as clear economic coercion, using their control over essential inputs as leverage against Western restrictions on advanced technology exports to China. It's seen as violating the spirit, if not the exact letter, of WTO principles of free and fair trade.
And finally, what about transparency, especially regarding their military buildup?
That's another area where their actions raise concerns about adherence to international norms. Despite officially maintaining a no-first-use policy for nuclear weapons, the sheer speed and scale of their nuclear arsenal expansion, combined with a very low level of transparency about stockpile size, deployment locations, and doctrine, is seen as destabilizing by many countries.
Lack of transparency breeds mistrust.
It does. And it's not just nuclear. There have been reports and concerns raised, for instance, about intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM tests, where the flight paths have reportedly crossed over international waters near other countries, sometimes even overflying places like Japan, allegedly without providing the kind of full timing notifications that are considered standard international practice for such tests. This kind of behavior increases regional anxiety and the risk of miscalculation.
So, putting it all together, South China Sea, trade materials, military transparency, the pattern suggests a strategic approach where China benefits from the global system when it suits them, but feels free to disregard the rules when they conflict with what Beijing defines as its core interests or strategic objectives.
That seems to be a consistent interpretation of their actions over the past decade or so. Yes, it's a selective engagement with the international rules-based order.
All right, let's bring it all together now with that core economic conflict and apply the 5-star meal versus daily bread test. Remind us of the setup again.
Okay, the setup is the U.S. restricts China's access to the most advanced, cutting-edge semiconductor chips, and the specialized equipment needed to make them things like ASML's EUV lithography machines. That's the 5-star meal, high-end, sophisticated, not essential for basic survival, but crucial for top-tier performance, especially in AI and military tech.
And China's response?
China retaliates by restricting exports of critical raw materials like gallium, germanium, and specific rare earths. These are foundational inputs needed across a vast range of global industries. That's the daily bread essential, widely used materials needed for basic industrial functioning.
So the question is China's restriction of daily bread a proportional response to the U.S. restricting the 5-star meal? What does proportionality even mean in this context?
In international relations and law, proportionality generally means an action taken in response should be necessary, and the harm caused shouldn't be excessive compared to the goal you're trying to achieve. It's about balance. So we need to look at the goal and the impact of both sets of restrictions.
Okay, let's analyze the U.S. chip controls first. What's the goal there?
The stated U.S. goal is primarily strategic and national security focused. It's aimed at slowing down China's military modernization and preventing the PLA from gaining a decisive technological edge, particularly in areas like artificial intelligence that rely heavily on the most advanced chips. It's also about maintaining a U.S. and allied technological advantage.
And the impact?
The impact is very targeted. It hits China's ability to produce the absolute highest-end technology. It causes significant long-term structural challenges for specific sectors within China's high-tech ambitions. But the direct cost or disruption to the U.S. economy, or global civilian industries generally, is relatively low. at least in the short term. It's a focused, strategic move.
Okay, now let's look at China's rare earth and mineral controls. What's their goal?
The goal appears to be primarily retaliation and leverage. It's designed to inflict pain on Western economies and industries to pressure the U.S. and its allies into lifting their chip sanctions. It's a counterpunch aimed at forcing a policy change.
And the impact of restricting gallium, germanium, rare earth magnets.
The impact is far broader and less targeted. These materials are the daily bread because they are essential inputs for a huge range of global industries: electric vehicles, wind turbines, smartphones, medical devices, defense systems across the board. Restricting them causes significant short-term cost increases and supply chain disruptions for manufacturers worldwide, including in many third-party countries not directly involved in the chip dispute. It hits civilian industries just as hard, if not harder, than military ones.
So when you compare the two, restricting a highly specialized, military-relevant luxury good versus restricting foundational industrial commodities needed by everyone.
The conclusion many analysts reach is that China's retaliation is disproportionate. Restricting the daily bread inflicts much wider collateral damage on the global economy and non-military sectors than the U.S. restriction of the five-star meal. It's seen as a more coercive tactic because it disrupts the basic functioning of multiple global industries, rather than targeting a specific high-end capability.
So strategically, it might seem like a powerful move in the short term, but ethically and in terms of proportionality, it raises serious questions.
Exactly. There's a fundamental difference between denying access to the pinnacle of technology with direct military applications and weaponizing basic industrial materials that underpin global commerce and the green energy transition. The latter is generally viewed as a more escalatory and less justifiable form of economic warfare.
And isn't there a final irony here? Doesn't this kind of retaliation potentially backfire on China in the long run?
Absolutely. This is the major strategic self-harm element. While these export controls might give China some short-term leverage and cause headaches for Western companies, their main long-term effect is to accelerate de-risking and de-Sinicization.
Meaning countries will actively try to find alternative suppliers.
Precisely. By demonstrating unequivocally that it is willing to weaponize its dominance in these critical materials, China proves itself to be an unreliable supplier. This forces the U.S., Europe, Japan, South Korea, and others to make massive investments in diversifying their supply chains.
We're already seeing this, right? More investment in mining and refining outside China.
Yes. Huge investments are flowing into developing rare earth and critical mineral projects in places like Australia, Canada, Vietnam, even reviving processing capabilities in the U.S. and Europe. It takes time and money, but China's own actions are providing the strongest possible incentive for the rest of the world to break its monopoly.
So by trying to choke off the daily bread, China essentially guarantees that the world will build its own bakeries elsewhere, ultimately eroding China's long-term market power and leverage.
That's the likely long-term outcome. It's a classic case of winning the battle but potentially losing the war. They gain temporary leverage but sacrifice long-term strategic influence and market trust. They force global diversification in a way that years of warnings probably never could have achieved alone.
Wow. We have covered a huge amount of territory today. From the T-dome missile shield soaring over Taiwan
to the deep historical shadows in the mirror that seem to shape Beijing's worldview.
And all the way down to the gritty details of gallium, germanium, and that five-star meal versus daily bread fight.
It really boils down to those two central images, doesn't it?
Oh.
First, the Taiwan shield.
Right.
It kind of represents the necessary, if difficult, effort of the democratic world to actively defend itself, to raise the threshold against coercion, to build resilience in the face of pressure.
And second, the China mirror, reflecting those deep-seated historical insecurities, the externalized blame, the anxieties of an authoritarian system that maybe lead to that self-defeating cycle of chokehold and swagger, ultimately damaging its own standing and trust in the world.
Yeah, and maybe the final thought to leave you, our listeners, with is this. When the world focuses on building shields, it's generally looking outwards, trying to defend against perceived threats.
Right.
But when a nation seems constantly preoccupied with looking in the mirror, seeing only past insults and perceived disrespect, maybe it risks missing the bigger picture.
And what's that bigger picture?
That true national strength, lasting strength, probably isn't found in nursing historical grievances or in aggressive defiance or the ability to make others afraid. Maybe it's found in internal truth, in accountability to your own people, and in building genuine trust with the rest of the world.
That's definitely something to think about.
Now, as always, we need to be clear. Everything we've discussed today is based on publicly available information, reporting, and strategic analysis. It's intended purely to explore these complex issues objectively.
Absolutely. There's no intent here to criticize or discriminate against any particular country, group, or people. Our goal here on Sip and Talk is always just to encourage critical thinking and independent understanding.
We hope we've given you some food for thought today.
We certainly hope so. Thank you so much for joining us for this Sip and Talk session. If you found this interesting, please do subscribe so you don't miss our future conversations.
And definitely check out our old friend Mickey's YouTube channel. It's called Mickytolife. He's got great takes, often funny, on global stuff, plus some cool travel vlogs and tastings. Always entertaining.
He does indeed. Give it a look. Thanks again for listening, everyone. We'll see you next time on Sip and Talk.
Bye for now.